Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining Community Conversations today as we discuss considering stress and trauma during the COVID-19 pandemic, implications for administrators, teachers, parents, and families. And to do a welcome, I turn it over to Dean Lane from the School of Education at the University of Albany.
Great. Thank you, Jerry, and welcome to all of you and we're glad you are here with us today. My name is Jason Lane, and I have the great privilege of being the Dean of the School of Education at the University at Albany. School of Education was created in 1844 as New York's first public teachers college. Over the past 175 plus years, we've been at the lead of educating the next generation of teachers, of leaders, policymakers, researchers, and mental health practitioners. Over 6 weeks ago, as the pandemic was setting upon all of us, our faculty and our students realized quickly that it was important to leverage the collective resources of the School of Education and those of the University at Albany to support our colleagues in the communities around us, particularly educators and mental health practitioners and parents. We created a new website called Remote ED, remoteed.org, that is a compilation of resources available for parents and teachers to navigate the current crisis education that we're dealing with as children are being educated at home in combination between parents and families. We also realized in all this time it's important to be able to come together in community and in these conversations weekly to discuss various issues of relevance to the community at hand. Today we're tackling, I think, one of the most critical issues that we're all dealing with, and that's mental health. How do we deal with stress and trauma during this current situation? We know that the pandemic has created a great deal of additional stress for many folks, exasperating existing stressors and creating new ones. And so as we all learn to live within this new environment, it's really important that we focus inward, take care of ourselves, take care of those around us, and making sure we have the appropriate skills to be able to manage these new environments. So I'm delighted today that Alex and Elena have joined us for this exciting presentation. I will turn it back over to Jerry to continue with the introductions.
Thank you, Dean Lane. I would like to now turn it over to our presenters, Dr. Alex Pieterse and Dr. Elena Gordis.
Okay. So I should start now, right? Can we move to the next slide? So first, I want to thank everyone for coming because I think one thing that we're all noticing is it's hard to do a lot of things in this pandemic. It's really, really stressful. It's like it's become the water we're swimming in, but it's all around us and we're stressed out. So even just getting to a talk, I think deserves some acknowledgement. So I appreciate your being here. And another thing I want to do is an experiment, and I'm going to come back to this later, but I'm going to time 30 seconds. And what I'd like everyone to do is count how many times they breathe in 30 seconds. So a complete breath is inspiration, exhalation. So inhale, exhale, that's 1. So I'm going to tell you when to start, and I'm going to tell you when to stop, and then remember the number that you have. And I'm going to ask you to, enter it in a poll afterwards, okay? So ready, go. Stop. Okay. Now, how many breaths did you take in those 30 seconds? It's multiple choice, so you can find the answer for yourself. Okay, I'll give it another few seconds. Okay, I'm going to end the polling, and I think it will share the results. And just remember your number too. Can you all see the results? Yeah. Okay, so just remember what that looks like. We have about 11, 18, 6, about 25% are 5 and under, and the rest of people are 6 and up. So just keep that in mind, and we will come back to that. Okay, now I close. That was my first ever Zoom poll, so amazing. Okay, next slide, please. So now I'm going to step back and just give you an overview of what we're going to do today. Alex and I will both be talking, and we'll talk some about the effects of this pandemic on our functioning. We're going to focus on stress and trauma and grief. And we'll also talk about how the effects of this pandemic are affecting people of color even more so. There's an increased vulnerability, and we want to highlight that. Then we're going to talk about different strategies that might help. Emotions, physiology, behavior, cognition, or thoughts, and our social interactions are all linked, and all of these things are affected. And so I'll go through, or we'll go through together, different areas and different ways that we can intervene in each of these domains that might give us some relief. We're interested in your experiences too. I noticed that a lot of people who were signed up are in education, are teachers, and so you all are faced with a lot of consequences of this in your lives. And so we will speak for about 25 minutes, and then we'll have some time for discussion to hear what kinds of things are affecting you and what kind of things work for you. Next slide, please.
Elena, just to jump in quickly.
Yeah.
I also want to just encourage folk, to think about things that they can share with us afterwards as we conclude the slides. But it also hit me that, I'm coming into this space from varying perspectives. Clearly one is as a psychologist, as an educator, but I'm also coming into this space as a parent with 3 kids who are meant to be learning at home. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting to engage this space, sharing information, but also being impacted by the very information that we're going to be talking about as well. So I'm looking forward to hearing what other people are going to share as well.
Yes, I can relate to that too. And we are all dealing with a lot. We're all in the same pandemic, but we also are all have varying experiences with it. And so one thing I want to highlight is that we can't know necessarily how other people are experiencing this global pandemic. What are the specific effects that people are having? How is it affecting their own sense of safety, security, family interactions, what kinds of things they've lost? So when we make attributions for other people's less than positive behavior, I would encourage us to think about what we don't know that they're experiencing, because one theme of this is that if we can all be more gentle with ourselves and each other, we'll function better. So one thing that is true, though, is this pandemic exerts a lot of trauma and stress on us in different ways. And this is not an exhaustive list, but it's a list of all the many different ways that we might be experiencing trauma and stress from this. We may be fearing our own illness. We may fear from our family. We may have a loss of safety from the illness or other consequences of the illness. We may have lost economic stability, housing, employment. We have a sense of uncertainty about the future and loss of control, which are very stressful for us. Some of us are very proximal to traumatic events. If we're first responders, if we're seeing the direct effects of the illness and loss of life. We may be parenting under very difficult situations with young children at home who we're supposed to be schooling when they don't want to be schooled at home, and also trying to manage very busy work schedules, or we may not have and we may be privileged just even to have work. And so we may wish we had work when we don't. People are being subjected to bias and hate crimes. And there's, as I mentioned, disparities in the effects of the illness, which we'll focus on more. And whereas for some of us being home is very safe, there are people for whom not being able to be away from home is really dangerous. People are confined to difficult relationships, abuse, and violence in the home with little ways to feel safe and escape. So all these things may be going on for people. Next slide, please. We also are experiencing grief. We may be grieving the actual loss and passing of loved ones due to illness. And also we're grieving the fact that we can't spend time with people that we love. And that's very difficult. We're grieving the loss of routines and activities that are important to us. Our whole way of life is missing. And we're also missing life events, graduations, other celebrations that can't happen now. So these are really sad things for us. Next slide, please. And this is how I feel about uncertainty about the future. I don't know about you. I don't like it much. I really like to know what's going to happen, and we don't know, and it's really hard. I gave that a whole slide. Next. Trauma and stress affect us. They affect our psychology. They affect how we behave. So these are just some examples of how stress affects us. It makes us irritable and depressed. It makes us anxious and worried. It may cause problems with sleep and eating. It may make us feel really tired. It may make it difficult to function, to concentrate, to make decisions, to get things done. All of these things may be things that make other people upset with us and make us upset with ourselves. But I think remembering the attribution that we're all under a lot of stress can help us understand these in a more benevolent way. Next slide, please. Alex, you want to talk about this?
So it's interesting that, I think about 2 weeks ago or so, when the data started emerging about the disparate impact of COVID-19, both in regard to mortality and some really very startling statistics, and also frequency of infection that is being seen now across racial lines. Rightly so, there was a lot of information, a lot of emphasis, a lot of attention that is being brought to that. But in our discussion of trauma and stress, I think it's also important to recognize that because of the racial history and racial structure in our society, the way groups of color and indigenous folk might be experiencing the COVID-19 pandemic in the context of stress and trauma is most probably also being influenced by prior experiences of stress and trauma that people of color and indigenous folk in the United States have experienced. And so we thought we'd include these ideas just to get educators, mental health workers, just to kind of encourage you to keep this larger context in mind when you are responding to the needs of people of color and indigenous folk in the United States. So clearly, there is research to show that people of color tend to be at higher risk for trauma reactions subsequent to disasters or other major experiences of trauma. And the thinking behind that is associated with both experiences of historical racism and then ongoing discrimination, and certainly currently seeing hate and bias. Also the fact that disproportionately people of color tend to have higher levels of folk living with lower income, which adds to general insecurity, general stress. The reality of inadequate access to healthcare, also the experience of healthcare provider bias that might impact how people of color and indigenous folk interact with health-related institutions, and then also just the history of systemic and scientific racism in our country that also might impact a sense of mistrust, a sense of cautiousness when we are engaging with mental health providers or with larger institutions of physical and mental health care. So again, it's just an important context to keep in mind that COVID-19 and the pandemic at the level of stress and trauma might also be having a differential impact on people of color and indigenous Americans.
And one other thing that I would add too is that people who are feeling more disadvantaged don't have as much control over being able to work in a safe way. So if they're told, oh, you have to go back to work, that exposes them to more risk too, and they're disempowered. So it's definitely worth keeping, it's something we need to keep in mind. So stress affects us physiologically. And so these are a couple ways that we are affected. First, the sympathetic nervous system is one branch of the autonomic nervous system. And when we're under stress, when we're feeling attacked or stressed out, this leads to an increase in heart rate, an increase in respiration rate, pupillary dilation, our hands get sweaty. This is great if you're being chased by a lion or you need to fight someone to defend yourself. It's not so great when you're stressed out, but you're trying to relate positively to the people around you, right? Across species, when your sympathetic nervous system is activated, across species are less prosocial and affiliative when their sympathetic nervous systems are aroused. So this is challenging. So when you're, interacting with a loved one and or a child that you're dealing with in a school setting, and they're very agitated and belligerent, this could be part of what's going on. High levels of stress make us like this. So that's one, we're going to talk more about this as something to help a wait place to intervene. Another stress process that happens is the stimulation of the hypothalamic-Pituitary-Adrenal axis. So a hormone that you might be familiar with is cortisol. This is a stress hormone. When the HPA axis is triggered, there's a whole cascade of events that happens. And one of the key things is that the adrenal glands secrete cortisol. And what's supposed to happen, cortisol allows us to mobilize energy and engage with a stressful situation in a way that preserves us, like that keeps us going. But then the stress is supposed to end and our cortisol levels are supposed to return to more baseline levels. And this is important because high levels of cortisol circulating through your system are not good for you. They're toxic to areas of the brain like the hippocampus. And so when we're under chronically high levels of stress, our cortisol levels become chronically high, and that generates wear and tear on the system. It may lead to adjustments in how the system functions. Certain mental health and other medical problems are associated with cortisol levels being too high or too low. So the system is really important, but chronic stress can be problematic for it. I don't tell you this to stress you out and say, oh my God, your cortisol is going high. You should be stressed out about that. The good thing about it is there's a lot of plasticity in this system. So if we can manage our stress, it will actually have really good benefits for our mood and our overall health, and even our hippocampal volumes, apparently by the research. So there's a lot of hope that if you can manage your stress, this process can, there's a lot of plasticity in terms of the damaging effects of cortisol. Next slide, please. So when trauma is more extreme, and that means different things to different people, right? Because different people experience trauma in different ways. Different people experience different events as traumatic, particularly depending on the context of one's experience. And I think thinking about minority health disparities is an important context for evaluating what constitutes a trauma. But we also identify intense responses that are part of what we call post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm sure that's a familiar term to most people. But just to go over what the clusters of symptoms are that are part of PTSD, in addition to the experience of the trauma, there's the intrusive re-experiencing of the traumatic event through flashbacks, nightmares, intrusive thoughts and memories. So, for example, someone who has seen a loved one pass away from the COVID pandemic might have intrusive thoughts of those events that would be consistent with this, or flashbacks. PTSD is also associated with avoidant behavior, avoiding anything related to the trauma, or even sometimes avoiding any kind of strong emotions or connections in the extreme. In addition, one cluster of symptoms involves negative alterations in mood or cognition. So feeling sad, also having negative thoughts about how the world works, having like existentially negative thoughts about one's own role. This is my fault. The world is not safe. Those kinds of shifts in the way people think and feel about the world. And finally, changes in arousal or reactivity. So an exaggerated startle response, being really hypervigilant about safety, problems with sleep, those are all part of that cluster. So having those, like all those symptoms and those clusters can be an indication of post-traumatic stress disorder worth getting professional help with. We have treatments for that. But also, all of these symptoms can make interpersonal relationships really difficult. So it's worth keeping in mind that if that's going on for someone, if they're behaving in a difficult way, they might be experiencing these kinds of things. Next slide, please. Thanks. Grief affects people in different ways. These are some consequences of grief for people, or expressions of grief, but there's no one right way to grieve. So there's a lot of, these are the steps of grief, but there's not one right set of steps for grief. But when people are grieving, they're often sad, may experience denial about the situation that they're in grief about, or shock. And I think one of the most important things is that waves of emotion often come over people, often like seemingly out of the blue. Something might set someone off, and people find this very difficult to deal with. But emotional experiences just wash over people and make them feel very distressed. Next slide, please. So, as I've kind of been alluding to, all of these consequences of stress, grief, trauma affect how we relate to each other, and they affect our behavior. So we may act angry and irritable, we may feel unmotivated, we may have difficulty getting things done, we may have increased conflict with our family and with our kids, and our normal expectations, which can provide a guardrail for us for how we should act and cope and get us into routines, can pull us out of those patterns, but they're absent right now. And our normal structures of life are absent. And many of our coping strategies are not available. We can't gather in groups, we can't go out with friends, sports, the gym, all sorts of things are not available to us. So for us to be able to cope with these effects, it takes some intention and some thought about what to do to help ourselves. Next slide. I think this is Alex, yeah.
So what we're trying to do here is to provide some context in which people could kind of perhaps understand what they are experiencing, understand what a loved one might be experiencing, and then also think about strategies to perhaps ease some of the stress. What we don't want to do is for people to self-diagnose. So while we are sharing a lot of information, we are not doing it for the purpose of diagnoses. And also, I think what makes it challenging is if you are living in a time where the world does feel unsafe and you are having that reaction, to some degree, it's a normal reaction. And so part of what we want people to do is to think about ways to gauge your reactions. And I think assessing your reactions in the context of how it's interfering with personal relationships is one way in which you could gauge that to some degree. So we want to shift to thinking about how to manage stress in a way that is healthy and effective. And we thought we'd kind of introduce this section by just doing a quick reality check. As Elena has already mentioned, part of the difficulty that we're currently experiencing is beyond just the increased stress because of the pandemic. We also have less access to those activities that might actually be beneficial in helping us relieve stress. So folk who might experience support or appreciate the experience of social gatherings, either through a church, and you do not have access to that, not only is your stress increased, but your ability to engage in activities to reduce stress is also decreased. And so that's a kind of context we want you to think about as we move into different strategies that you could utilize to help manage your own reaction, but also help manage the reaction of either family or people that you interact with on a day-to-day basis. Next slide, thanks.
So I just thought maybe I'd start with some general thoughts about what might help us function better. And just the last line there says, observe yourself and what helps you. And I think we can be a really good N of one study for ourselves if we notice, like there's a lot that can be gained from noticing yourself and when you seem to be feeling better and when you seem to be feeling worse, and seeing what's going on for you in all of these domains that I'll talk about: thoughts, feelings, behaviors. Just even acknowledging the difficulty of the situation can help, right? It seems like we should be solving it, but even if we can't solve it, if we acknowledge it, that can help us. Trying to be gentle with ourselves and others And as I mentioned, being aware that others' behaviors may be being driven by these stress and grief and trauma processes, lowering our expectations for what we're going to accomplish in this time, taking things one day at a time instead of getting really wrapped up in what's going to happen down in the future when things are uncertain, and prioritizing our health. So if it's between making your child do the history report on time when they're suffering and you're pulling your hair out, versus saying, you know what, maybe that's not the most important thing right now. I need to be healthy and I need my child to be healthy. Those, I may be alienating the teachers on here, so I'm sorry, but choosing health is something I would argue for. Next slide, please. So just thinking now about emotions as a place where we can work to try to feel better. So we can't solve emotions, right? Emotions just are. They're not good, they're not bad, they may be unpleasant. They may, if we act on them in ways that aren't helpful, that could be a problem, but in and of themselves, they're not threatening, they're not going to hurt us. So if we can acknowledge and name our emotions, it seems really simple, but it really will bring us relief. And even expressing emotions can be important. If you think about toddlers, they feel their emotions really strongly. So they get really happy and then they let go of it. And then when they're really upset, they scream and cry and then they let go of it. Whereas as we get older, we want to hold on to those happy feelings. We do everything we can to avoid negative feelings. And it's not so productive. So I would say, try not to fear the emotions and just acknowledge what they are. This is really important with grief in particular too. Next slide, please. So physiologically, I keep talking about how stress makes things very difficult. And so one of my mantras is, if we can lower our stress level and reduce that sympathetic nervous system activation, it's going to help us. So remember the number that you had, and we had about 75 people at 6 or higher breaths in 30 seconds, which translates to 12 breaths per minute or higher, and most people were higher than that. So really, when we're stressed out, we tend to hyperventilate in subtle ways, right? So we really want to aim for about 10 breaths per minute, 10 to 12. So those 6 people were like close there. But what happens is when we breathe faster, our sympathetic nervous system predominates over our parasympathetic nervous system, which is the other side of the autonomic system, which is more the rest and digest side, which also facilitates prosocial and positive behavior. So when we can bring the pace of our breathing down, it will engage our parasympathetic. And there are other consequences of this, but overall, it will make us feel better and will make us relate better to other people. So these are a bunch of strategies to help with that. The simplest one is just pacing your breathing. There are different things you can do. People will count 4 or 6 counts in, hold it, and then breathe out slowly. To me, being told to count my breaths does not help me. It makes me more stressed out. That's just my experience. There's apps that can help you with this though, but a really simple way to slow your breathing down is to just breathe through your nose, because when you breathe through your nose, it slows it down. Your nostrils are smaller than your mouth. And so it will take your breathing down. If you can pace your breathing and slow your breathing down for like 5 to 10 minutes, 10 minutes is aspirational, it's a long time, but if you can get there multiple times per day, it will help you. It will help you bring your stress level down. Other strategies can help with that. Meditation and mindfulness are important. There are apps that can help with this. Mindfulness is great because it focuses on what's going on right now, and will also help with some of the thinking problems that can get us really stressed out. So focusing on the exact moment that we're in can bring us calm and can make us focus less on anxious thoughts about the future. Finally, relaxation strategies that involve guided imagery and progressive muscle tightening and relaxing. So we call that progressive muscle relaxation. These are really useful strategies. PMR has been around for a really long time and has a lot of support for reducing anxiety and depression. And you can find resources for these kinds of things online easily. But in PMR, you are guided through tightening and relaxing all the major muscle groups of your body. And it just leads to a sense of calm. And it's very easy. It takes practice, but it's a very straightforward skill. So doing this can really help us be more gentle with ourselves and with others. And that will help also with social support, which is another source of coping. Next slide, please. So some of these are probably pretty obvious, but they're not easy. So these are some behavioral strategies to help us feel better. You can see this guy is taking a run through the snow in Albany in May. So that's nice. He's very brave. But regular exercise helps with mood and helps with stress management. And it might take some creativity if you're used to exercising in the gym and the gym is not an option. But if you can find ways to do some exercise, walking, running, yoga, doing things in your house, that is a really great strategy. Trying to get some sunshine can lift your mood. Limiting exposure to the news. Many of us are very hooked into following the news all the time. And here, observe yourself. If you notice that when you're listening to the news or watching the news, you tend to be more anxious. And if you disengage from the news and put some limits on it, you might find yourself feeling better. Regular sleep is really important. Sleep and mood are very intertwined. When people present with depression, we target sleep separately from actual mood because sleep is very sensitive to disruptions in mood and anxiety, and then also exacerbates disruptions in mood and anxiety. So it becomes like a snowball effect. So trying to keep your sleep regular will be very helpful if you're feeling challenged. Healthy eating, also very difficult at times, but important. And in general, and this relates to healthy sleep and eating, trying to have a routine can help you maintain these positive strategies. But also being gentle with yourself and flexible when it falls through, because things often don't go as planned. Next slide, please. So in addition, our behaviors and our emotions are also intertwined with how we think about things. So you can become an observer of your thought process. When you feel more versus less upset, what are you thinking? Often, these are two traps that often go along with feeling really stressed out. Catastrophic thinking, where you get really ahead of yourself, thinking about the worst possible things that can happen. And this can go really fast. We have conversations in my house where my husband says, I'm not going to engage in 3 what ifs, like 1 what if. That's as far as we'll go, because it's just really easy to get far in the future. So when you notice yourself doing this, stop and say, okay, I'm getting too far in the future. Let me focus on the present. I don't need to worry about that right now. Dichotomous thinking, similarly, can lead to really feeling sad and anxious, because in dichotomous thinking, you might think everything has to either be perfect or it's terrible. And things are pretty mixed right now at best. And so dichotomous thinking can make us feel worse. So kind of noticing what your thought processes are and trying to make them choose more positive ways of thinking about things can help. Again, mindfulness comes up because it's a strategy that can quiet those like catastrophic and dichotomous and other kinds of like ruminative and obsessional thought processes. Because when you're in the moment, you can't really be worried about the future, and you can't really be ruminating about the past. You're in the moment. So it really works to turn down the volume on those kinds of thoughts. It's a skill that takes practice, but it's one that can help. Next slide, please. Social support is one of the best protective factors against the negative effects of traumatic events and stress. So it's kind of unfortunate that we're kept away from a lot of our social supports now. So here again, as Alex was saying, it requires some thinking and some creativity about how we're going to engage in social support, finding ways to connect with friends and loved ones. Phone, Zoom, spaced out, socially spaced out ways of being together. Those are really important. I think it's worth noting that certain ways that we talk might be more ambiguous, like if we're texting and emailing, and because we're more stressed out, it's easy to interpret things in more negative ways. So all of these other strategies that might make us be more gentle with each other will help, given that there are barriers to social interactions during this time. It can be very uplifting to do things that help other people. So finding ways to volunteer, either virtually or safe things that you can do in real life, can be extremely uplifting for us and for our kids. And because we're all challenged, there can be additional conflict between parents and kids about what everyone is supposed to be doing. And I would just argue for choosing our battles here because, again, overall, reducing stress, increasing positive social connections is really important to our functioning. Next slide, please. So also, it's important that people know that they can reach out for professional help. So these are just, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are things that Alex and I were thinking about where people might want to reach out for professional help too. A lot of people who used to be doing only in-person therapy are doing telehealth now. And I think it's broken down a lot of barriers for people to be able to get help, and I advocate for that. So persistent symptoms of depression and anxiety, and depression can manifest as irritability in children and adolescents, PTSD symptoms, thoughts of self-harm or suicide, hopelessness, difficulty functioning, feeling like you need to talk to someone, significant relationship problems, isolation, and a lot of people who have previous mental health issues are feeling like they're getting kicked up. So all of those things to me seem like good reasons to reach out, and I would encourage that. So those are just the kinds of things I was thinking about. Alex, if you have more to add, or we could open it up to questions and comments.
Thanks, Elena. There are just a couple of thoughts that I would like to add. Jerry, I wonder if we could go back to the slide on emotion. How long will it take us to get back there? So given that, there's a range of folk who have joined us or listening today, teachers, educators, mental health professionals, family members, parents. For those of us who are in the position of either being responsible for the well-being of others, or for those of us who are needing to create a space that feels conducive to well-being, I think it's really important to encourage the expression and acknowledgement of emotion. However, I also think it's important to appreciate that because of various influences, be it cultural, be it gender, etc., that people emote in different ways. And so to be able to acknowledge that, to appreciate that, to actually understand what are ways in which people express emotions that feel more consistent for them, I think is useful. So for the educators, for the teachers, as you're trying to help kids emote in ways that are healthy and effective, I would encourage you just to keep that context in mind. And for those of us who might be in a position where we can actually inform policy, I was struck, Elena, by your list of behavioral ways to manage stress. I wonder, Jerry, if you can just go to that list, that slide on behaviors. I think there we go. So I was struck by the idea of healthy eating, which is so critical to maintaining general health, but also maintaining mental health. And we currently have a situation where a lot of folk are deprived more so than what they typically are. You think of food deserts and things like this, where they really are deprived to get at least that as an example of the type of behavioral approach that could help them manage their stress. So for those policymakers who are perhaps joining us, I would just encourage you to think about what policies can be put in place right now that attend to those folk who are having particular difficulty maintaining a healthy diet, getting regular sleep, etc. So again, just encouraging us to think about how these apply to us, but also how they apply to larger groups that we work with. And thanks, Elena.
Absolutely, yeah.
So Jerry, we're going to turn to you to kind of guide us through the remainder of the time that we have together. I think that we were hoping to elicit some questions, and we would do our best to respond, hopefully in a way that would be helpful. Or Cheryl, I don't know if you were going to be part of that process for us.
So Alex, I think we have a thought from Andrea about the hardest part is the juggling act. If you want to talk through that for a moment, because I'm guessing there are a whole lot of us who would agree with her.
Oh, I can take a stab at that. I'm not sure how helpful what I have to say will be. But so that's something that is very much part of my day-to-day experience. You know, juggling professional, personal roles. And now and then I will have experiences where I feel heavy. I just feel heavy. And then this is going to sound completely silly, but I'll catch myself and saying, oh, there's a reason you're feeling heavy. And that's okay. You know, so I would say recognizing how difficult it is to challenge, to balance and juggle all our roles, give ourselves permission to be just good enough.
Mm-hmm.
Just good enough would be some ways in which I am kind to rationalize my way of making my way through all of this.
I echo that, and I think it's untenable, right? Like, it's very difficult, and I think having to be 100% perfect in every situation is, in general, not possible. But in this situation, it's even harder. And I think for me, the being able to focus on, okay, when am I feeling better versus when am I feeling worse? And what are the things I can do to talk myself down when I start feeling overwhelmed helps me a lot. Like I guess it's not central to the actual juggling, but I feel like when I can talk myself down, I'm more able to tolerate the difficulty that I'm experiencing in the moment and name it and have it feel less frenetic and terrible. But I think multitasking is also really a hard one because it increases our stress, and we're kind of like, we need to multitask to get a lot of stuff done. And so I think finding ways to carve out places where you can just have some quiet for yourself, at least for me, that helps too. And being okay with needing that. I don't know.
So Kathleen, would you like to ask your question right now?
Sure. My question is, often in school systems, people look to those in positions of leadership to provide very clear direction, of course, and answers to questions. And right now there's so much uncertainty. There's uncertainty over what September will look like. And we want to be transparent and truthful with people, but a lot of times there are answers we just don't have right now. And I know when we deliver that, because they look to us for more certainty, we're perhaps contributing to their stress and anxiety. So is there any way or any ideas that you have for us to help people cope with the ambiguous nature of the times that we're in?
I do have a thought about that. And Alex and I are both directors of clinical and counseling programs where students are also feeling terrible uncertainty about their practica and their hour. I mean, and so I can absolutely relate to what you're saying. To me, and we don't have the answers. So that's stressful for us because we want to have answers, right? Our job is to make people feel okay and better. We want to lead the way. So, okay, I acknowledge that that's really hard. And also, we can do a lot by acknowledging other people's feelings. Like, here's where being gentle and reflective can be really helpful. You can't solve all the problems, but you can say, I know this is really hard. I wish I had answers for you. And I know that it's very stressful right now. And here's, like, when I can give some information that I think is somewhat reassuring, I will try to do that. But I think just acknowledging it, because I think, when we get stressed, we get defensive, right? And so sometimes when I get questions from students and I don't know the answer, I'm like, why do they keep asking me this question? I don't have the answers. How could I possibly know? And then I say, wait a second, they're just really stressed out. So I make a different attribution. This is the stuff that's right. They're stressed out. They want to know. I'm stressed out. That's why I'm having this reaction. Okay, calm down. I know this is really stressful. And then I can react in a way that's more helpful to them, even though the reality of the situation has not changed. But I think the best we can do is acknowledge each other's feelings and model that, because ultimately that is the most important thing. It's how we relate to each other.
Kathleen, I'll respond as well, just to add to Ilana, what Ilana has said, to share an experience that I think is going to be very common with a lot of us who are on this discussion. Our eldest son is a senior. The first part of the year was spent with great anxiety, worrying about whether he would get into college. That anxiety wavered as admissions started coming up, and then COVID hit. And so all of that excitement vanished into anxiety, and then disappointment about not graduating. And then just yesterday, he was told that the college he's going to attend is going to be fully online in the fall. And so it's been interesting as a parent, but also as an educator. Parents and educators are in positions where we are supposed to know. And so in a space where we don't know, I think some vulnerability and some humility is also useful. Mm-hmm. And sometimes if we can validate, if we can be open with our own experience, that actually is in and of itself supportive for people that we are working with. And so my challenge has been to be with my son as a parent and not as a psychologist, and say, yes, it sucks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you.
We have several comments about the importance of setting boundaries and also the complications and difficulties of setting and then maintaining those boundaries. So perhaps if you could talk about boundaries for a few moments.
Well, I'm sitting in my house talking on Zoom to a bunch of people, right? Like our boundaries are all really, really changed. Not all, they're changed, right? We're not, Alex and I were just talking about this earlier today. Everything we're doing, the boundaries are all different and our structures are different. So I guess I can't say that I've managed this totally wonderfully in my own life, but I think trying to figure out what works for you. I mean, I guess I would just acknowledge that, yes, this is really difficult. People may have found ways of setting limits to when they're going to check their work email and what they're going to allow their children to, what devices they're going to be allowing themselves and their children to be on. Alex, what have you, I don't have a great answer to that.
Neither do I, Elena. I do think, sometimes when boundaries are challenged, a response to the challenge is to become more rigid around the boundary. And I'm not sure if that's a helpful approach right now. So perhaps one thing I would say is perhaps less rigidity, but more clarity. So be really clear for yourself and with others what the boundary is, but don't necessarily be rigid. Allow for some flexibility, but I think clarity is mostly more important at a time when the boundary is a little fuzzy.
That's good.
In terms of uncertainties, Michael Slater has a point. If you want to talk about that right now, Michael, as a physician.
Thank you. I'm an emergency medicine physician. I'm practicing just outside of Chicago. We started hearing inklings of COVID end of December, early January. Started preparing and planning in February, and the treatment guidelines have changed every week or two. How are we ventilating people? How much fluid? Who's likely to be sick? Do you need risk factors? How much community transmission? Are we giving hydroxychloroquine? Are we not giving hydroxychloroquine? All these things that have changed in the space of only a few months. And it's only been a few months. So even having been a physician out of residency for 21 years, I'm back to feeling like I, don't know what I'm doing. I can't tell from looking at somebody. My usual gut sense of who's sick and not sick is all completely out the window. So if you feel as if anybody feels as if the healthcare system has been chaotic and educational system has been chaotic and social services have been chaotic, we're all in the same boat. Thank you, and thanks for a great presentation. I've really, really appreciated the wisdom.
Thanks for your work.
Mm-hmm.
So from Clarence Johnson, if you could speak a little bit about the stress level for parents and teachers who work with special needs students for a few moments.
So, we did a community discussion a few weeks ago, and we were talking about equity and the context of dealing with kids who have special needs came up in that discussion. And part of the challenge here is, and I'm talking about unique needs broadly defined. So you are working with kids who possibly to some degree had a lot of their needs taken care of in the formal school setting, and that's been taken away. And so now you are having to find a space to respond to their needs indirectly. You have to rely on family members or parents and have to equip and inform them as well at the same time. And so the stress level clearly is just up exponentially. And so the question, of course, is what do you do? How can you respond? And again, this will not be profound, but what I would encourage is not to do it on your own, to be very deliberate, very intentional about the collective that you surround yourself with, the people that have what you cannot provide, and to be very deliberate. Again, that's not a profound or insight, but I think it's just to remind people that we are in a position where we cannot do this alone. We need each other, and to be very deliberate about that and allow yourself to reach out.
And I think that that speaks to the point that is raised by Karen Gill about the need, and then Rochelle spoke to her about making sure she talks with her district as she's making decision about her daughter's mental health. So. And lots about multitasking and moments where that's harder than others. So I think everyone can appreciate all of your advice and the notion to be gentle with ourselves and with others in this time.
Cheryl, I know that our time is running out rapidly here, but I wonder if there are any people who could kind of just share with us one thing that you're doing that you have found to be effective in managing your own stress or managing stress of others. Any insights would be helpful. Crying. Going for walks.
Music.
The list is beautiful.
Yeah.
Getting 10,000 steps. As I'm reading the list, I'm trying not to feel guilty.
I'm just looking at my Fitbit.
Yoga over Zoom.
But I think it's a great plan to collect these ideas, because it has to do with, like, the intentionality piece, I think, is like, we were all functioning, in a certain way before, and certain things were par for the course. But the point now is that we have to be intentional about how we're going to care for ourselves and acknowledge the enormity of what we're dealing with. So like just concretizing some of the strategies that we can use as go-tos. They won't all work all the time for everybody, but having options is useful. This is great. I'm going to save this.
Well, I want to thank Dr. Gordis and Dr. Pieterse for joining us today and sharing their experiences and their work regarding stress and trauma. We talk about the new normal, but I think Dr. Slater stated it pretty well in his sharing with us today, that it's hard to have a new normal when everything is shifting and changing every day, every week. And so the best thing that we can do is, and you're right, Alana, is that we need to be intentional. And, they always, the saying that's going around, put the mask on you first, you do have to take care for yourself, because the days and nights all blend together. You lose sight of which day of the week it is. You're stretched thin because of all under one roof. You are working, a caretaker. And there is no separation anymore. And so, and if you're not at your best, you can't be your best for your family, and more importantly, for yourself. So I want to thank you all today, and I specifically want to thank Dr. Gordis and Dr. Pieterse for giving us their time and their experience on this very important topic. And I want to thank all of you for sharing your time with us today. But before we take leave, I'd like to draw your attention to the remoteed.org website. You will find a copy of today's presentation, as well as the chat box notes as well, and the PowerPoint available. We do have a mental health section, and you'll find this information there. We have over 300 curated free resources available for parents, teachers, and schools. So we welcome you visiting that site, and also feel free to share any resources at that site. There's a place where you can upload information if you feel that there's something that we should have that we don't have already on the site. It's changing daily and weekly, so we continue to curate items that we think will be of value to our community. With that, I thank you again for joining us, and I wish you much happiness and health.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I hit the stop sharing, and thank you. It was wonderful.